The sawdust covered everything, and Kevin Matthews watched it happen with quiet, controlled rage. He stood at the property line between his land and the sawmill next door, watching the bulldozer push another massive load of wood waste onto his property. The operator in the cab didn't look at Kevin. He never did. The operator just angled the bulldozer bucket and released the load. Sawdust, wood chips, bark fragments, all the leftover material from the sawmill that had no commercial value, no use. Just waste. Just garbage that needed to go somewhere. That somewhere was Kevin's land. This had been happening for 8 years. 8 years of watching Dale Thornton's sawmill dump their garbage on his property, like it was some kind of free landfill. Kevin had called the county environmental office multiple times. He'd called the state. He'd sent formal letters to Dale Thornton demanding it stop. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever changed. Thornton came from money. Old money. His family had owned the sawmill for 3 generations and had connections with everyone in Marion County who mattered. He had expensive lawyers. Kevin had 30 acres and a belief that right should matter in this world. Right didn't matter in Marion County, Arkansas. Money mattered. Power mattered. Kevin's property rights didn't matter. Kevin was 52 years old and had lived his entire life in the Ozark foothills of Arkansas. His family had farmed this region for generations, going back to his great-grandfather. Not large, industrial-scale farms. Small, mixed operations that produced enough food to feed the family and generate income at the local farmers' market. Vegetables, some fruit trees, a few goats and chickens. The kind of farming that required knowledge of the land, patience, and understanding of how seasons worked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't wealthy. But it was honest work, and it was his legacy. Or it had been. Now half his usable land was being slowly reclaimed and buried by a sawmill's worthless garbage. The soil in the Ozarks was naturally thin. Red clay, mostly. You had to work it carefully. You had to build it up. Kevin's grandfather had spent 50 years improving the soil on this property. Building fertility. Creating something productive from difficult earth. Kevin had continued that work his whole life. Now it was being buried. Kevin had anger about this. Real anger. The kind that sits in your chest at 3 in the morning and keeps you awake. But he also had something else. He had time. He had land that wasn't being used much anymore. And he had a stubborn refusal to accept that Thornton had won. One afternoon in early 2012, Kevin was standing at the edge of the waste pile when something caught his attention. Something important. The wood chips weren't just sitting there, inert and dead. They were actually breaking down. Rain had soaked them. The summer heat had worked on them. Bacteria and fungi and countless microorganisms were colonizing the material, breaking it down into something else. It was composting. Not efficiently. Not quickly. But the process was happening naturally. Kevin stood there thinking about his grandfather's garden. How the old man had made compost from everything. Kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, grass clippings, animal manure. He'd carefully layer it all together and let time do the work. By the next year, you had black gold. Rich, dark, living soil full of nutrients and life. What if he could do that with Thornton's garbage? What if he could turn the weapon being used against him into something productive? Kevin had never tried anything like this before. It seemed impossible. The waste pile was huge. There was no system, no plan. But Kevin was someone who noticed patterns. And he noticed that the waste, if managed right, might actually become something useful. He started small. He couldn't transform the entire pile at once. He began collecting the wood waste in a designated area instead of letting it spread chaotically across the property. He mixed it with fallen leaves from the surrounding forest. He added kitchen scraps from his house. He added goat and chicken manure from his small livestock operation. He layered it all together the way his grandfather had taught him, back when Kevin was just 8 years old and helping the old man work in the garden. It was the most patient revenge Kevin could imagine. Not angry, not combative, just quiet transformation. For weeks, nothing visible happened. The pile just sat there. Kevin would turn it with a fork 2 or 3 times a week, mixing the material, introducing air into the decomposing mass. In the heat of summer, the pile actually steamed. Kevin understood what that meant. Decomposition was happening actively. The materials were breaking down at the molecular level. Billions of microorganisms were doing their work. By fall 2012, something miraculous had occurred. The pile that had been sawdust and wood chips and bark had become dark, almost black. When Kevin squeezed it in his hand, it held moisture and crumbled into his palm like actual soil. It smelled like forest. It smelled like life. He spread it on a small test plot, about a 1/4 acre. He planted vegetables there in spring 2013. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. He just worked quietly and watched what happened. The vegetables that grew on that compost were enormous. The tomatoes were fist-sized. The carrots were thick and sweet. The lettuce was so vigorous it looked almost aggressive. Kevin harvested and brought it to the farmer's market, and people asked him what he was doing differently. "New soil," Kevin said simply. "Better soil." He didn't mention it was made from garbage. The success emboldened him. He expanded the composting operation. He started collecting wood waste more systematically. He organized the piles better. He turned the material more carefully. By 2014, he had nearly 3 acres of the richest, blackest soil he'd ever seen. His yields multiplied. His vegetable sales tripled. He started buying more goats because the pasture that had been bare and useless was now producing grass. He bought more chickens. He expanded his orchards. The land that Thornton had been destroying was becoming more productive than it had ever been, and Kevin had done it in complete silence. He'd never confronted Thornton. He'd never sued. He'd never even written another letter. He'd just quietly transformed poison into prosperity. By 2015, people in town knew something was happening on Kevin's property. His vegetables won awards at the farmer's market. His goat cheese was selling at specialty stores. His reputation grew. Someone wrote an article in the local newspaper about his miraculous soil. The article didn't mention the sawmill waste, but Thornton read it, and Thornton understood what had happened. One day in the summer of 2015, Thornton showed up at Kevin's property in person. Kevin was in the field, turning a compost pile. Thornton stood at the fence and watched for a while before speaking. "You've been using my waste," Thornton said. It wasn't a question. Kevin didn't stop working. "You've been dumping it on my land for 8 years," he said evenly. "I decided to use it instead of complaining about it." Thornton was quiet. Kevin could see him looking at the dark soil, looking at the thriving vegetables, looking at the evidence of what Kevin had created. "I want to buy your formula," Thornton said finally. "I want to sell compost. Your compost. I'll pay you $50,000 for the method." Kevin finally stopped working and looked at his neighbor directly. "No," he said. "You won't negotiate?" "I won't sell it," Kevin said. "But I'll teach it. Not to you. To the farmers around here. To anyone who wants to learn." Thornton's face went red. "That's insane. I'm offering you $50,000. "I don't want your money," Kevin said simply. "I want this region to understand what it can do with waste. With patience. With understanding how soil works." Thornton left angry. But something had shifted. Kevin's refusal to be bought, his insistence on sharing the knowledge instead of profiting from it, made his quiet revolution even stronger. By 2016, Kevin had become the unofficial composting expert for the entire Marion County farming community. He was teaching the method to a dozen other farmers. By 2017, that number had grown to 30 farmers. They formed a loose cooperative, no official organization, just farmers who understood what Kevin had discovered and wanted to replicate it. They shared detailed knowledge about material ratios, proper turning schedules, seasonal timing, and where to source wood waste from mills across the region. Within 3 years, there was a whole network of small farmers in Marion County and surrounding areas who were creating premium compost operations from the wood waste that sawmills produced as byproducts. They weren't competing with each other. They were teaching each other, building on each other's knowledge, creating something larger than any individual operation could be. Kevin's land had transformed into an educational teaching farm. Agricultural extension officers regularly brought college students there to learn about soil science and composting practices. Universities sent researchers to study his soil composition and document the transformation. Environmental groups came to film and document the project as a model for sustainable agriculture. What had started as one man's quiet, controlled anger at injustice had become an economic and ecological movement that was changing the region. Thornton tried to copy the method, but he couldn't. He approached it like a business problem that could be solved with capital and machines. Kevin's approach was different. It was about patience, about understanding timing, about working with nature's processes instead of forcing results. You couldn't buy that knowledge. You had to learn it over time. By 2020, Kevin's original 3 acres of compost-enriched soil were producing more value per acre than any industrial farm in the county. His vegetables sold for premium prices. His teaching work was generating income from workshops and consultations. His reputation had transformed from a struggling farmer trying to survive into a regional agricultural innovator. Kevin never became wealthy, but he became something better. He became respected. He became trusted. He became someone that other farmers looked to for guidance. In 2022, a documentary filmmaker came to film the story of Kevin's composting operation. The film showed the before and after. It showed the barren land covered in sawmill waste. It showed the transformation into black soil. It showed Kevin teaching farmers. It showed the regional network of farmers all using the same method. The film aired on public television and won awards. But Kevin's favorite moment wasn't in the film. It was a moment that happened quietly, in 2023, when Dale Thornton's sawmill closed. The business wasn't sustainable anymore. Thornton sold the property and moved away. Years of dumping waste had been his business model. He'd never imagined anyone would turn his garbage into an asset. Kevin bought the sawmill property at auction, not to run the sawmill, to restore it, to turn it into a composting facility and teaching center for the regional network of farmers he'd helped create. The man who had dumped garbage on Kevin's land had, without knowing it, given Kevin the opportunity to transform not just his own farm, but the entire region's approach to waste and soil health. Kevin stood on the sawmill property in 2024, looking at the facility that was being converted into an educational center and composting teaching space, and thought deeply about patience, about how you genuinely cannot rush true understanding, about how some of the most powerful and meaningful responses to injustice don't involve fighting back directly. They involve transformation. They involve taking what was meant to destroy you and turning it into something that builds others up. He thought about his grandfather teaching him to make compost when he was just 8 years old, how that knowledge, dormant for decades, had suddenly become the most valuable thing Kevin possessed, how his grandfather's wisdom, passed down across generations, had been the key to everything. He thought about Dale Thornton, who had tried to destroy his land and his livelihood, and how Thornton had ended up giving him the raw material for something far greater than either of them had imagined at the time. The Ozark soil that Kevin had inherited from his family was naturally thin and difficult. But with patience, with genuine understanding of natural processes, with a willingness to transform what others discarded as worthless, it became something extraordinary. Something that supported not just his own farm, but an entire regional movement. That's what soil teaches you, if you're willing to listen long enough. It teaches you that everything broken can be healed. Everything discarded can become valuable. Everything poisoned can be transformed into something beautiful and productive. You just have to be willing to work quietly, to trust the process even when it seems impossible, to understand that some victories take years to unfold, and the sweetest victories are always the ones you share with others.